Now that we have our theater model box created in Vectorworks, I'm going to import it into Cinema 4D so that we can start doing some lighting and coloring and texturing and get to the really fun stuff. But before I bring our theater model box in, I just wanted to show you a few things in Cinema 4D. When you first open it up, you're going to get a screen like this. We have the main window is our perspective window. On the right hand side we have the object manager, and we have the attribute manager, and down here across the bottom we have the materials manager. Those are the four things that we're going to worry about to begin with. The other things that you see here, this is the timeline for animation. We're not going to worry about that yet. And this is the coordinates manager. We don't need to worry about that yet. Up here at the top we have our menu bar with lots of tools. Down the side here we have what I call the modes bar. I don't know exactly what Cinema 4D calls it, but it's modes essentially. Very similar to how we had modes in Vectorworks. One of the great things about Cinema 4D is that it's very adaptable. You can change its interface to suit your working style. So there's so many different ways that you can adjust things to arrange the real estate that works best for you. The first thing I would just want to show you is that when I hover over a border between two window panes, I get this little movement icon. So if I click and drag, I can resize windows. So you can see that the attributes manager and the objects manager is taking up way too much screen space. So I'm just going to move the whole thing over. So now we have much more room for our perspective window. You'll see at the top right hand corner of the perspective window there's four little buttons, and those four little buttons, the first one, if you click and drag on it, it's panning. You can pan around in your scene. The second one is dollying. You can dolly in and out on your scene and then rotate around the scene. And the last one, when you click on that, it shows you four different views, and now you have a top view, a front view, and a right view to go along with your perspective view. And again, you can click and drag to change the size of these if you want. I tend to just leave them the way they are. The other thing that is very important, and when you first open up a document in Cinema 4D, the attributes manager is going to show you the project settings. And the only thing you need to worry about at this point is measurement it's using. By default it's always in centimeters. This program and Vectorworks are both owned by the same company, and it's a German company, so they work in centimeters. I work in inches. You could set it to feet or yards if you want, but I'm just very used to working in inches. So when you type in 24, you know it's 24 inches, and that's 2 feet. Alright, so I'm going to set that to inches. If I didn't do that first, anything that I create or import into the program, it's going to think it's centimeters, and it's going to be essentially in the wrong scale. So we got to put it to inches first. So I'm going to go back to Vectorworks, and here's our theater model box. Because these two programs are owned by the same company, they have some amount of integration. So in Vectorworks, under File, there's a Send to Cinema 4D, 3D only. It's only going to send the 3D elements. It won't send the dimension lines or anything else that was just drawn in 2D. So I'm going to do that. The first time that you do that, it may ask you to locate the Cinema 4D application in your applications folder, but it's going to show you exactly where it is, and you just click on it. So we get this dialog box, and I just always say OK. And so here's our theater model box. Up here in the objects manager, it has this heading. That is like the whole grouping of all of our elements. If I click on the little plus symbol, it'll twirl it down. Now you can see that we have geometry, lights, planar objects, and cameras. It's under geometry is where our actual model exists. So I click that to twirl it down, and it says design layer, and I click on that plus symbol, and now we actually see our actual geometry. So if I click on extrude, you can see that that was our stage. And if I click on the solid addition, that is our proscenium. So those are the only two things that I really want at this point. So I'm going to click on where it says design layer, and I'm just going to drag that out. You can see it has a little arrow next to it, so you know when it's going to go out. And then I can select this other and I just delete the whole mess to get rid of all of it. By default, the extrude, which I'm going to double click on extrude, and I'm going to call this the stage floor. And I'm going to double click on solid addition, and I'm going to call that the proscenium. Over here you can see that the proscenium has a black color to it and the stage floor has a white color. I don't want either of those, so I'm just going to drag a marquee over both of those and delete them. Okay, now as I pointed out before, we have these 3 buttons for moving around in our scene. Naturally, there are also keyboard shortcuts, and I don't remember exactly what the keyboard shortcuts were when I got Cinema 4D, but I changed them to make them similar to all the other programs that I have. So I have the space bar is actually pans left and right, up and down, and I have that the option key does the rotate, and because my trackball has a scroll wheel, the scroll wheel dollies in and out. So I'm going to be using those mostly. So I'm just going to rotate around so that we can look at this sort of from a front. I know we have a front view here also. What I wanted to show you first, and I'm going to go back to just the perspective. You can see that our proscenium arch, the curve is sort of segmented. It's like flat and then flat and then flat and then flat. And it just, to me, looks really bad. I played around with this. I don't know exactly why it's coming into Cinema 4D in such a shape, but I found a solution. So I'm just going to delete this for now. I'm going to go back to Cinema 4D, and what I found is that what solves the problem to me the best is to select my proscenium arch, and I'm going to modify it. I'm going to convert it. I'm going to convert it into a mesh. So if I have Vectorworks do the conversion into a mesh before it goes into Cinema 4D, it seems to work much better. And when I do that, you can see it's got all these lines on it, and we're going to clean that up later. I could also convert the stage floor, but the stage floor, this curve is not as big a problem when it goes into Cinema 4D. So now I'm just going to go back and do the send to Cinema 4D again. Say OK. Twirl these open. What this is called in Cinema 4D is called parent-child relationships. So where it says Vectorworks Scene Theater Model Box, that's the parent, and the rest of these underneath are called children. So I'll twirl this down, twirl this down. Here's my 2 pieces of model. So I'm just going to drag this out so it's no longer a child, and I'll delete the rest of it. And now, well, first I need to get rid of the colors that comes with the default. Now you can see that our proscenium arch really is a much cleaner sweep to it. It's not as fragmented as it was. But we've got a whole lot of extra geometry that we really don't want. All these lines. All these lines are indicating different polygons. Even though this is one big flat surface, in the 3D model it's being broken up into all these different polygons. And you can see with the stage floor, it also, even though it's just one big flat surface, it's being broken up into all these different polygons, and we just don't need all that. So I'm going to select the proscenium arch, and I'm going to go to Mesh, Command. I'm going to go down to Untriangulate, but if I let go on Untriangulate, it's not going to bring up the dialog box. To get the dialog box, I have to go over here to this little symbol, and when I release on that, it will bring up the dialog box. Untriangulate. And what I need here is to create n-gons. I'm not going to explain what n-gons are, but it's a much simpler way of creating the 3D object. So create n-gons, say OK, and you can see now it's gotten rid of all those lines. I mean, it just looks prettier, and it's a much more efficient model. Now I'm going to select the stage floor, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. Untriangulate. And now you can see that the create ingons is going to be selected from here on out. So that's good. And it gets rid of all those extra lines. So that's the first thing we wanted to do. Again, I'm going to double click on this and call it the theater. This is my stage floor. And this is my proscenium. Okay. These two little white squares next to my objects, that indicates that they're assigned to a layer, and I don't want to fool with layers at this point. By dragging a marquee, I can select both those objects, and under Edit, I can remove from layer, and you can see it gets rid of those white boxes. Alright, now what I want to do, I want to create a camera and some lights. The perspective window, it's showing you what they call the editing camera or editor camera, but I'm going to create a specific camera that's going to be out in the center of the house, and it'll always be right there in the center of the house, and I can go back and forth between the editing camera and my camera out in the house. Up here we have the camera symbol. I'm just going to click on camera, and it sets a camera. You can see it over here in the object info, and it sets it wherever I was with the editing camera. It just puts it in that same place. We're not actually looking through the camera until we click on this little symbol and it turns white. Now we're looking through this perspective window is now the camera. And with the camera selected, you see down here in the attributes window, we have all these different tabs. I'm going to start with coordinates. So the X is my left and right, and I can double click on this field to highlight it, and I'm going to put that at 0 so that my camera is on center line. The Y, I'm just going to do 8 feet up off the floor. The stage floor is at 0, 0. You can see here the stage floor is at 0, 0. The Z, I'm going to double click. I'm going to do that at, let's say, minus 600. So that's 600 inches. Alright, then over here we have the rotation. So the H is heading, the P is pitch, and the B is bank. So I want my heading to be straight on, so I'll double click and I'll make that 0. I'm going to leave the pitch where it is for now. So you can see that in our perspective window we're zoomed in way too far. We want to see at least more of the proscenium. The first thing I want to do, you can see here that there's 3 buttons. These 3 buttons have to do with rendering. The first button is to actually render something. The middle button is to render just like an area of our window. And the third button is for rendering preferences. So I'm going to click on the render preferences. It's render settings. The first thing that it's on is output, and for the film aspect ratio, by default it's on standard. It's a 4:3. I always put it on HD TV 16:9. Most computer screens, most TV screens, most everything anymore is in an HD format, 16:9. So I'll do that first. I'm just going to lock the ratio for kicks. Instead of looking at the height and width in pixels, I would like to look at it in inches. I always set this at 10 so it'll fit on a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. That's just what I do. The resolution, I always put this at 300. Again, you can do what you want. So now we know that our image resolution when we render it out is going to be 3000 by 1687. The next thing I want to look at is save. Here by default it's on TIFF, and I always tend to put it on Photoshop because that's what I'm going to be editing it in. Alpha channel is important when you have no background object and you want to render something that can be cut out in Photoshop and have the background removed. I tend to most often always select the alpha channel so that when we take the rendering into Photoshop we'll have that alpha channel. The rest of these I'm not as concerned about. There's one other setting that I want to add, and so to add a setting we click on effect, and there's all these different effects that you can add. The one that I want to add is ambient occlusion. What ambient occlusion does is where objects meet in like a corner, it will emphasize that corner so it has better contrast and you can like see the detail of your model much better. and so I just like to add ambient occlusion. It also lengthens the rendering time. So if you have, you know, a really massive model and lots of lights and lots of shadows and just everything going on, if you add ambient occlusion, it may slow down your computer so much that it will take too long. But this is a very simple model. We're not going to have that many lights, so I'm going to use ambient occlusion. The rest of these I'm not going to play with at this point, so I'm just going to close out the render settings. Now you can see in our perspective window, we have a much wider, it really is a 16:9 aspect ratio. But now we're zoomed in even further on our proscenium and we can barely see it at all. So making sure that the camera is selected, the next tab I'm going to look at is Object. And we can see here it's using the perspective window for the camera, and it has focal length and sensor size, and so by default it's on this classic 36mm. I'm going to go to wide angle, and now you can see with the wide angle I'm getting much more of my proscenium. The rest of these settings I'm not going to adjust at this point, but I'm still zoomed in a little bit too far. I'm not seeing my apron. So I'm going to go back to coordinates, and with each one of these fields you can see on the right hand side there's these little arrows, and what you can do is it's very difficult sometimes, but you can click on the up arrow and that's going to zoom me in. You can see that the dimensions are changing, or I can click on the down arrow and I'm backing out. Or if you click and drag on any of these arrows, you can interactively go in and out. It's much quicker to go greater distances. So I'm going to go to here, and then with my pitch I'm just going to double click on this and make it 7. I like round numbers. And then I'm going to click on the down arrow so that my perspective window, the camera goes down a little bit. That looks better. Now one thing, and this is very much a personal preference, you can set it however you want, but to me this proscenium is tipping in so much, it is distorted a little bit too much for my taste in the perspective. So I'm going to go back to Object, and here in the field of view, instead of 70, I'm going to change this to maybe 65 might work, which zooms me back in, so I need to go back to my Z and back the camera out. So I'm just going to hold down on the bottom one and it's going to zoom back out a little bit. And then I'm going to go to the P, which is pitch, tip it down just a little bit. Also, when you click on these up and down arrows, if you hold down the Option key, it will go by point, like point 1, point 2, point 3. So now I'm going to hold down the Option key and click on the up arrow. You can see it goes 5.1, 5.2, so then I got a little bit finer adjustment. Okay, so to me this is looking a lot better. I can see my apron at the bottom and I can see my proscenium at the top. I could zoom in maybe a little bit more because the proscenium isn't, what we're interested in is the scenery and not the proscenium. But in this exercise there is no scenery on stage. I want to see the proscenium. Alright, so now we have our camera set, and I'm just going to take a second to save this document, and I'm going to call this stage model tutorial and desktop tutorials. Save. Okay, it's always a good idea to save your work often because you just never know when a program is going to crash. My experience with Cinema 4D is that it's pretty stable, but 3D model programs crash every once in a while and you don't want to lose hours and hours of work. I don't think I've ever experienced a crash with Vectorworks, but with 3D model programs, every once in a while there's a problem. So now I have my camera set. The other thing that I tend to want to do is just arrange things in the list here, and I tend to always put cameras and lights at the bottom. So I'm just going to drag the camera down. Next I'm going to put in some lights, and you can see that there's a little light bulb symbol here. If you click, it will open up into several different types of lights. So I'm going to use spotlights because we're in the theater. And you can see that one thing I don't have, you can't actually see the cone of the light, and that's because up here at the top of each window you have different headings, and one is called filter, and it doesn't matter which one of these filters you click on. Changing it in one window will change it in all the windows. And you can see that I have the camera and the light and the environment are all deselected. So in order to see the cone of the light, I'm going to have to select the light so that we can actually see it. Now you can see that there's a cone, and by default the light has been inserted at 0, 0 and it's pointing straight up stage, which is not anything what we want. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the X to 500, and again this is all in inches. The Y I'm going to put at 500, and the Z I'm going to put at 500. And you can see that there's this little blue arrow, and it's telling me that my light is outside the box, outside the window in that direction. So if I just zoom back a little ways, you can see where my light is back there. Now actually I want this to be a front light, so I want it to be out in front of my theater. So instead of plus 500, this needs to be minus 500. Now our light is in front of the theater. The heading I'm going to put at 45 degrees, and the pitch I'm going to do this manually. So I want to get the light to point essentially at the center of our stage. So I'm just going to scroll this down, and that looks pretty good. So it's minus 36. I'm just going to double click and make it minus 35 because I like round numbers. In our perspective, you can see now, you can see where the light is starting to hit our proscenium. But the cone doesn't look like it's going very far. But by default, the light is set to infinity. The light is just going to keep going and going and going forever. In reality, lights in the theater don't do that. Over distance, they fade out. So we want to create that same kind of effect. So that's under details over here in the attributes. There's a tab for details. And fall off, currently it's none. I'm going to set that to linear. There's a few other types of fall offs, but linear is what we need to use most often. When I select that, it's now going to show me that the radius of decay is 500 inches. So that is where it's showing the light ending right there. That is 500 inches. And you can see now that the light is just barely catching our proscenium, but it's not hitting the stage floor at all. So we need to increase that radius of decay. So I'm just going to click on these little arrows and scroll up, and that's going to lengthen my light. And I'm going to do it so that it goes all the way through the stage floor. So now we can see that it's hitting the proscenium and it's hitting the stage. It's much brighter on the proscenium than it is on the stage. The other thing I'm going to do, I always like to have the 0, 0, whether it's in Vectorworks or in Cinema 4D, I like to put the 0, 0 right at the plaster line. Currently the 0, 0 is back here in the middle of the stage. When the theater model box was imported from Vectorworks into Cinema 4D, it just put it right in the middle of the scene. So I'm going to first pull this light down here. I'm going to select the theater. There's a lot of different ways that I can move the theater model box. You can grab on these handles. You know, I can move it left and right. I can move it up and down stage. This little green handle, I can move it all around. And again, over here you can move by using these handles. Okay, so I'm going to undo, 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 get me back to 0, 0. So I could click on this blue arrow and move it back. And you can see that it's showing me inches that it's moving. So that is close. Now I'm going to zoom in so that we can really see what it's doing. Okay, so I need to go a little bit further. So I make sure that theater is highlighted, and I go to the coordinates tab. And you can see that this is sort of a random number. First I'm going to double click on it and make it a round number, 190. Now I'm going to click on the up arrow, and it's going to move back by inches. And so now it's exactly at 0, 0. So it's 192 inches that I had to move it back. Okay, now we can see that our light is no longer hitting the proscenium in our perspective window, and it's hitting the front apron of the stage. So what I'm going to do is select the light, And I'm just going to move it upstage a little bit because right now the light is crossing center right at the plaster line. And most of our scenery is going to be upstage here. So I'm just going to move the light up about 10 feet. And what you can do in any of these fields, you can do mathematical equations, and that is also true in Vectorworks. Within any of their fields you can do, 10 plus 2 will equal 12. At times it's quicker to do it that way, especially when you're dealing with inches in Cinema 4D. 500 inches, I don't even know what that is in feet. I would have to figure it out. So what I can do is insert the cursor plus 120. Okay, so that moves the light upstage 10 feet. Now our light is hitting our proscenium and it's hitting the stage. It's not as much on the apron as it was. So we're getting closer. But I don't really want it to be spilling on the proscenium all that much. Unfortunately, we don't have shutters like we do in the theater. So I just need to change the angle of the cone, the spread of the light a little bit. So to do that, under details, we have an inner angle and an outer angle. Currently the inner angle is set to 0. What the inner angle and outer angle does, the fall off is making the light go from 100% here at the light source, and it's falling off to 0 by the time it gets all the way down here. The inner cone will have the full intensity wherever it is from the light, and it will fade down to 0 at the outer cone, so it makes it a much more gradual transition rather than a harder line. So I'm going to set an inner cone of 10%, and now you can see I've got a couple extra lines, so that's my inner cone. So anything inside the inner cone is going to be at full intensity, and outside of the inner cone it's going to start fading off. I'm going to set the outer cone at 20%. So now I just have a much narrower beam of light. And you can see over here in the perspective window, I'm just catching the proscenium a little bit, but mostly it's a spotlight on the stage, and that's where I want it. Okay, one last thing that I want to set with this light, because what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this one light, so I want to get everything set just the way I want it. Under shadow, by default it's on none. I'm going to put it on shadow maps, which is soft. The shadow maps renders more quickly, but the shadows are soft. If you want to have like really hard edge shadows, you want to use ray trace. It takes longer to render, but it has a much sharper shadow. We tend to use that when we're rendering something that's outdoors, because the shadows outdoors tend to be much harder. Shadows in the theater tend to be softer. That's just my own opinion. So it renders faster, so I'm going to use the soft shadows. The other thing I tend to always want to change, the density of the shadow. Shadows are never, in my opinion, 100% ever. So I'm going to change that to 75%. It'll just make the shadow a little paler, and you'll be able to see detail in, whatever the shadow's being cast on, you'll be able to see detail of inside the shadow. We could also change the color of the shadow if we wanted, but I'm not going to worry about that. And there's a whole bunch of other settings, but let's not worry about them. And I think that's all the settings that I want to set for this light. So now there's a couple of different ways we can duplicate a light. I can do Command-C for copy and Command-V for paste. Or if I click and drag the light while holding down the Control key, you can see that it has that little plus symbol in the square, and that just duplicates the light. And it will give it a slightly different name, the 0.1, just so that you can differentiate between the two different lights. I'm not going to worry about naming my lights at this point. But with this second light selected, I'm going to go back to the Coordinates tab. With the X, instead of having this a plus 500, I'm going to go to a minus 500. So now I have two different front lights, but I need to get this one to point at the stage. So in the heading, I'm going to change this from plus 45 to a minus 45. And now I have two front lights that are 45-degree, very McCandless theory of lighting. To me, this tends to create sort of a generic work light. When we really get into modeling and you want to get fancy with lights, you can start putting side lights and back lights and top lights and down lights and up lights, and you You can color the lights, you can do anything you want. For now I'm going to create these 2 front lights and I'm going to create 2 back lights. So I'm just going to click and drag holding down the control key again to duplicate that light. Now I'm going to change the Z from minus to plus. It puts the light in the back light, but I need to rotate it around. So the heading now needs to be minus 135. But you can see that this is now this is moved 10 feet downstage because I moved this one 10 feet upstage. So I need to move this back upstage. In the Z I'm going to change this back to 500. And then I'm going to add another 120. So now you can see that this cone of light is crossing center stage. 10 feet upstage from plaster line is where it's crossing. And I'm going to click and drag holding down the control key again to duplicate that light. And now I'm going to change the X from minus to plus. And I need to rotate this light around so it's pointing at the stage. So I'm going to take this and say plus 135. Now I've got 4 lights that are all crossing right here at the same point, center stage. That's a good place to start. I may have to adjust the lights as we go along, but that's what it's all about. Having all these lights, it gets very confusing in all the different windows. It's just too much information. That's why I always, in the filter, I deselect the lights so that I don't see them. When you have a light selected, you can still see the point of its origin, and you can see the point of it where it ends in each of the different windows. Okay? So now we have some lights on our stage, and the perspective window is showing you its best ability of a rendering, but when you actually render this out, it's going to look a whole lot better. And the way that we can make this perspective window show us what the rendering is going to look like is by clicking on this first rendering tab. You can see it says render view. So if I click on that, it's going to start rendering. Each one of these boxes is one of my processors. This computer has 4 processors, so there's 4 boxes that render. And this doesn't take very long to render. But you can see that with those 4 lights, all of the light is pooling here in the center of the stage. We can't really see our proscenium hardly at all. So I'm going to use what in the theater we would call a fill light, and I'm going to label it a fill light. I'm just going to click on the light bulb again, and that's going to set a generic light right here at center in each of my windows. And I'm going to click and drag this down so that it joins all my other lights, and I'm going to double click on this and call it fill light. And under the coordinates, I'm going to have it be 10 feet up off the floor. Double click, 120. I'm going to move it upstage just a little bit. I'm going to say 5 feet upstage. This is my fill light. So now you can see that that fill light is starting to light up my proscenium a whole lot better. And it's going to look much more realistic now. So I'll render that again. Okay, so now I can see the proscenium a whole lot better. Alright, the other thing I'm going to do with the fill light is under details, I'm going to give it a fall off also. So when I go to linear, you're going to see that it adds these dots out here. That's the extent of the fall off. If I go back to filter and do lights, you can see it's one big circle, and that's the fall off for this light. So now the things that are close to that light will be brighter, and things that are further away will be dimmer. So I'm just going to leave that at 500 inches. I may have to adjust that again later. Deselect my light so I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to say that my 4 main lights, I want to have them brighter. So you can see under intensity it's at 100%. One of the great things about playing God with this program is that I can make this more than 100%. So I'm going to say that these are all at 150%. It's just going to make them brighter. And this fill light, I'm just going to run it down a little bit so it won't overtake the other lights quite so much. I'm going to make it 75%. You can see that its type, it's called an Omni light. Essentially, it's just one big light bulb. So we have Omni light, spotlight, infinite light. That would be for sunlight. Area. In film and TV, when you have the really big lights and they put a filter on the front of it and it's like, 4 feet by 6 feet, that's essentially what an area light duplicates, or it replicates that kind of a light, so that its shadow is very soft because it's being filtered and spread out over a 4 foot by 6 foot area, or whatever size area you want to make it. If you had like a window in your set and it was say a 2 foot by 2 foot window that had frosted glass in it, you might want to set an area light for that, so that and make it 2 foot by 2 foot, and it would create a very soft light coming in that window, and the shadows would be very diffused. But for the most part in our scenic modeling, we're going to use Omni lights and spotlights for the most part. I can also set the shadows here, but for the fill light, I'm not going to do any shadows because it just increases the rendering time, and I don't really need those shadows. I've got shadows from the other lights. For now, to this point, our theater model box is just a basic gray color. It's the default color. You can see down here in our materials manager, these are our materials that got imported in from Vectorworks, and I don't want any of those anymore. I'm not using them. So if I click on function, I can go to remove unused materials, and I'll get rid of all those. There's a couple of different ways to create materials. You can go to create and new material, or you can do command N for creating a new material. What I always do is I just double click in this pane and it creates a new material. It's a lot quicker. So now you can see that over here in our attributes window, the material and all of its different aspects show up. The thing is that if you click on this basic tab, you can see that there's a whole lot more attributes that I could add. Currently only color and specular are selected, but you can add all these other different ones. But up here in these tabs, all of these don't show up until you select one of them. So now I select it, and now we have the bump tab. And you can click on different tabs to see different things. But to me, this is limiting, because I don't have all of these attributes unless I go to basic and select them and then go to the tab, and it's just too much work. So to me, the better thing to do is to double click on the material, and it brings up a window, and now you can see that I have all my attributes are all here on the left, and I can select different ones and change all their settings. It's just a much easier, more efficient way to work. My computer setup, I have 2 different monitors, and I always put all of these palettes all off onto the right monitor, so that my main monitor is just these 4 windows, so that I have much more real estate for the windows. I have to put everything, of course, onto one monitor for this tutorial so that you can see what I'm doing. You wouldn't be able to see my second monitor. So we have this material editor, and we can put it anywhere we want to keep it out of the way. So if I click on the color tab, first of all, specular. For the theater model box, I'm not going to have anything shiny at this point, so I'm going to deselect the specular. Back to the color tab, this little triangle down here at the bottom of the color strip, if you select that triangle, this gives you all the different ways that you can show color here. I've put it on enhanced color table. I think by default you're going to see RGB, and to me these RGB sliders is not very intuitive way to create color. So I like to leave it on enhanced color table, and now I've got this big window so that I can click around in it and find the color that I want, or you can click and drag for a more interactive way. And you still have your color handles over here. You've got values that you can set. You've got a bar across the top here so that you can change the hue to whatever hue you want. Okay, but what I want for my theater model box, it's just going to be black. But I'm not going to go all the way down to black. In real life, there is no true black. Everything has a little bit of color in it. Even like black has a little bit of color. Black velour is not really black black. It's dark, but it's not black black. So I'm going to go down here to 0, 0, and then I'm just going to change the V is for value. I'm just going to double click on that, and I'm going to make it 15 and say OK. Now you can see in my little sample here, it's black, but it's got a little bit of detail to it. And that just helps to be able to see lighting. I'm going to double click on where it says matte, and I'm going to name this theater. Alright, and then I can close this window just to get it out of the way. But still, our theater model box is just basic gray. I've created the material, but now we've got to apply it. There's a couple different ways you can apply things. You can click on the material and drag it and apply it. You can see the cursor turns into a plus symbol. I can apply it to the stage, or I can apply it to the proscenium. Or I can go over here to my list and I can apply it to the theater, and it applies it to both the proscenium and the stage floor together. That one color covers both of them because I put the color on its parent. Alright, so now with the perspective window selected, if by accident you have, say, top view selected or front view selected, and you go and you click on this rendering button, it's going to render whatever window is selected. So if I click here now, it's going to render the front view, and that's not what I wanted. So you got to make sure you have the perspective window selected, and then you can click on here and it's going to render your view. And you can see that everything is much darker now because we have a black material applied to both the stage floor and the theater. So in coordinates, I'm just going to have to run the camera back in. And now it's much more difficult to see it because I have this color on it, so I'm just going to delete the color for a second. Select the camera. And I'm going to run this back in so that it's just seeing the apron and just seeing the top of my proscenium. Alright, so then I'm going to put my color back on my theater model box. So for the purposes of this tutorial, this is not necessarily what I would normally do, but I'm going to give a color to my detail on the proscenium without putting color onto the rest of the proscenium. So it's just going to be the proscenium frame is going to have a little bit of color. But the problem is that the proscenium is just one big piece of model. I don't have a separate model for all this detail. So what I need to do is break down this model piece into what they call selection sets. I'm going to select different polygons and make them a set, and then color those polygons and color the other polygons a different color. So essentially I'm going to apply two different colors to our proscenium so that the frame has a different color than the rest of it. And to do that, I'm going to go back to the editing camera. So I'm going to turn off this little white symbol next to the camera. And now we're back in our editing camera. So when I move around and change the view, to go back to our camera that was out here in the center of the audience, all I have to do is reselect that camera and the perspective goes right back. If I deselect it, it goes back to the editing camera. So that's very handy. It's essentially like you have two different cameras. So now to select polygons on any object, over here in the modes bar, you can see that currently when I hover over this, it says that it's model, use model mode. What I want to use next is I want to use the polygon mode. You can see it says polygons, so I'm going to select polygons, which deselects that model mode. So now I'm in polygons mode, and you can see that the proscenium now has all these blue edging to it. That helps me to know that I'm in polygon mode. The other two modes here is we have line mode and we have points mode. So this is for editing, so I could edit different points, or I could edit different lines, or I can edit different polygons. And you can see how the polygons flash into white when I hover over them, and with the lines, the lines turn white when I hover over them, and with points, different points turn white when I hover over them. Alright, so I'm going to go to polygons. Up here in the toolbar, currently I have the move tool selected. It's got the 4 little arrows on it. You hover over it, it says move. Keyboard shortcut is E. Right next to it is live selection, which is keyboard shortcut is 9. If I click and hold on that, there's several different ways of selecting. Most often I'm going to do rectangle selection, so I can draw a rectangle around things to select them. But for this particular, for selecting polygons, I'm going to use the live selection. Okay. So now you can see the cursor has this little circle around it. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. When I hover over a polygon, it turns white. Actually, I'm going to start by selecting the front, and you can see it turns a darker blue when I select it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select all the polygons that aren't this proscenium frame. If I tried to select the proscenium frame, you can see how many polygons there are here. It would just take a long time to select all those. So to me, it's a lot easier to select outside of the proscenium frame. For this model box, since we're only going to see it from the front, I could stop right here at this first selection, but I'm just going to go ahead and select the rest of these polygons, just so that we have our model really complete. And I'm going to rotate around to the back. I'm even going to select the back. I'm going to rotate around so I can select this side. I'm holding down the Shift key to add selections. So now you can see that I have all of these polygons outside of the proscenium frame are all turned dark blue, so I know that they're all selected. They also have this orange edging that also helps me to know that they're all selected. Now I can go up here to a menu bar and select, and go all the way down here to set selection. When I set selection, you're going to see over here next to proscenium, now I have this orange triangle. If I hover over that, it says polygon selection tag. Down here in the attributes window, it's also showing the polygon selection tag. And I can name this if I want. I'm not going to worry about it. When you get very complicated models with a lot of selection tags, you want to start naming them so that you know which is which. But we're only going to do this one selection tag for this for now. Okay, so the proscenium currently, because the parent is colored with black, the proscenium by default is also being colored black. So I'm going to create another color, double click in the materials, double click on the material to get my editor. I'm going to leave the specular on for this one. I want it a little bit shiny. And for color, I'm going to make it sort of a gold color. And once I start coloring something, you can really see this specular a lot better. If I deselected the specular, that goes away, so it's a very flat, matte color. But I'm going to leave the specular on. I'm going to go back to color. Let's make this a little more gold. Okay. The specular, you can color the specular if you want. I'm just going to leave it white. The two things that I'm going to adjust is the width and the height. Currently the width is pretty wide and the height is not very high, so I'm going to make the height higher and the width less, and you can see it makes it a much more of a highlight on our material. If I right click on this little symbol, it's going to show me, by default it's showing this little ball. I can turn this into any kind of different type of object that I want. You know, I can make it a torus, and you can see the highlights a little better there. I can make it a rounded cube. You can see the highlights there. So you can play with that. Mostly I just leave it on default. Sometimes if I have a material that's really like a picture, I'll do a plane so that I can really see what the picture is. But for most of the time I just leave it on default. Alright, close that. Alright, so now I have this sort of gold material. I'm going to click and drag that onto my proscenium. And I'm going to go back over here to model mode. So I'm going to go out of the polygons and back into model mode. So now you can see if I turned all these lights off, now we're using the default light. Now you can see that I turned the whole proscenium gold because the gold is sitting on top of the proscenium, but the stage floor still stays black because it's using its parent's color. But I want just the gold to be just on this trim. So what I need to do is also apply the black color onto the proscenium, and now the whole proscenium turns black, but I want this trim still to be gold. So the way these tags work as you add colors, it reads from right to left. So it's going back towards the name of the object. So the black is overriding the gold at the moment. So I want this black to only apply to this selection tag. So with the black color selected down here in the attributes window, you can see we have here selection with a field box. So all I have to do is drag this selection tag into that selection, and it says polygon selection. So over here in the perspective, you can see now that my trim is all gold and the rest of my theater model box is all black. That's what I wanted. Alright, so now I can turn, I'm just clicking and dragging it up and it turns all those lights back on, and I can reselect with this little box here my camera. The perspective goes back to the center of the audience, and you can see the gold material around the trim here. So with the perspective window selected, I'm just going to render that window so I can see more accurately what it looks like. And you can see it's taking a little bit longer to render. If I turned off the ambient occlusion, it would render a whole lot faster, but it wouldn't look nearly as good. Alright, so the last thing I want to show you in this tutorial, I just want to put a person on stage, and I'm going to show you a technique that's very handy for a lot of different applications of putting scenery on stage. I'm going to use a flat cutout of a person. So in the old world of doing physical models, we used to paste a picture of a person onto a piece of mat board and cut out the mat board and stand it up in our theater model box, and that would help give us scale. So essentially that's what I'm going to do in this 3D modeling program. I'm just going to do a flat cutout of a person. So it's not really going to have dimension, but looking at it from out in the center of the house, it's going to look pretty good. Alright, so the first thing I need to do is I'm going to create a new material. I'm going to double click on that material. When I double click on it, the name is highlighted. I'm just going to call this person. I'm going to get rid of the specular because I don't want my person shiny. And so under color, and because I'm doing a pasted picture, this is one instance where I'm going to change this into a plane so that when I get the picture on here, I'm really going to be able to see it. Here under texture, with this little triangle, it has a lot of default textures that you can use. You can play with these and learn how they all work. I'm going to click on this little button with the 3 dots, and that's going to let me navigate to a place where I have a picture. I have this businessman TIFF. This is just a guy in a suit. You can also import pics or JPEGs or different file formats. What I have found handy is that the businessman TIFF, the TIFF file format, will include an alpha channel. JPEG won't. And we're going to use that alpha channel in a minute. So I'm going to double click on the businessman TIFF, and it asks me if I want to save that image with my project. I'm going to say yes. Okay, so you can see over here in our picture this little man in a suit with a black background. So now what I have to do is I have to add the alpha. So I click on the alpha tab, And here under texture, I'm going to use the exact same texture, businessman TIFF. Yes. And now you can see, because that TIFF has an alpha in this little image here, if I click on an image you'll see a bigger one. You can see the businessman with the black background. But here you can see it's essentially the businessman is in white with a black background. And so what the black is doing is it's eliminating all the area around the businessman. So it's essentially cutting that material out. So now if I create, now I have to create an object. Here under the cube, because it's got a little black triangle, there's going to be a lot of other things underneath the cube. So if I click and hold on that, it'll show me all these different objects that I can create. And what I'm going to create first is a plane for the man to sit on. So by default the plane is inserted and it's flat on the ground. I'm going to click on object. If I hold down the shift key, I can also click on coordinates so I can see both those tabs at once. And under orientation, instead of in the plus Y direction, I'm going to put it in the minus Z direction. There's a plus Z and a minus Z. I used to always put things in plus because it just sounded better to be in plus. But what I discovered is when I apply the man to the plane, he's going to be upside down. And you always have to flip him back over, and it's just, what I've discovered is that if you always go to minus Z, you don't have to flip the guy over. So I have to get the width and the height right. So I'm going to say that my man is 30 inches wide and 72 inches high. But the plane is at the axis of this plane is right in the middle of the object, and it's at 0, 0. So I have to move this up 36 inches in order for him to be standing on the stage. Now he's standing right at the plaster line, so I want to move him upstage a little bit. So I'm going to say I'm going to move him up 60 inches. So over here in our perspective you can see this gray plane that's been inserted. If I take the person material and drag it onto this plane, you can see that it cuts out the plane around the man. So we have just the man. And I can change the name of this to man. This image of this man is in grayscale. That's why it doesn't have any color. And it doesn't look like he's casting any shadows, but that's just because this rendering, the perspective window can't show shadows until we actually render it. So make sure that that's selected. Click on the render. Now you can see that there's 4 shadows coming out from the man. And he's right in our spotlight. So this is a very handy technique if you have, cut out profile legs of trees or a border of leaves or any number of things that are a flat cutout. You can create the model very quickly just using the artwork that you create in Photoshop and cut it out and put it in here, and you have instant stand-up scenery. Alright, so that's it for this tutorial, and I'll show you, I'm going to go back to Vectorworks next and create some 3D scenery that we can then bring into our theater model box.